I first met our featured guest today through another podcast because of our mutual love of sports, and Pastor Cameron Walcott joined me on the Church Pew Sports podcast. And
That's
it was,
right.
I think it was off microphone when you kind of told myself and my co-host, hey, by the way, someday I'd like to share with you the story of my son.
That's right.
Man, oh man, am I glad you said that. And you sent me a copy of your book called I Love You, Little Mister. And my wife went through it pretty quickly and had tears in her eyes a number of times. And it's a powerful, powerful story. I can't wait to share it with our audience today here on The Big Impact. And to kind of open things up, I'd love to have you just kind of fill us all in on what the Walcott family story looks like or looked like before an October day in 2020. What was life like and where were you?
Sure. Well, I grew up in Michigan, Clinton Township, Michigan, so Metro Detroit. When I was, in my early 20s, I went to Asia as a missionary. So I went to India, Philippines, and eventually I ended up in Singapore, where I met my wife, Dilia. So Dilia is a Singaporean, and when we got married, we intended on staying in Singapore for about 2 years. That was the plan. But then the church that I was working with, Cornerstone Community Church in Singapore, kept asking us to stay one more year, one more year. And 2 years became 11 years. And while we were there, God blessed us with three amazing children. Yeah. So Caleb was the firstborn, Evan, and Anna. So after 11 years in Singapore, we felt God speaking to us to move back to Michigan and plant a church. So that's what we did in 2016. And that's what we did. So with 3 kids, we moved with 11 suitcases, 3 kids, and myself and Delia. So.
Well, I know that our audience here for The Big Impact comes from all walks of life and all different kinds of backgrounds. So when you include the phrase missionary in Singapore,
right,
for some people it's like, oh, what an awesome story. He felt the Lord's call in his life and decided to go. And for some people who come from a background that's maybe not as steeped in faith, they're like, what on earth is he talking about? So what led you to make that decision, both ministry wise, and I guess you could call it career wise?
Yeah, well, at the beginning, I went to Bible school. So I went to seminary. I was training to be a pastor, and I had no intention to go overseas. I wanted to be a pastor in Michigan, wanted to stay in Michigan. I like American sports. I like American food. I knew missionaries. I knew people growing up who had lived overseas, and I admired what they did. But I was like, man, that's not for me. I'm all American. I'm all Michigander. This is this is where I want to stay. But really, when I was in Bible school, God just sort of gripped my heart. And, for all of the listeners who may not be as familiar, it's really just the sense of an undeniable calling that this is what I was born to do. This is what God created me to do. So initially it was India is where I just felt this calling, this drawing towards. So I worked in an orphanage, and as well as Bible schools in India. So that was the initial calling. And then it moved to the Philippines, where I also was working with young people and churches as well.
Well, so when you answer that undeniable calling, and you've said either publicly, privately, or in prayer, you've said, all right, Lord, I will go wherever you send me. And you never thought for a moment that he would be sending you to Asia. When you get there, I don't know if it's day 1 or month 2, or at some point when you've unpacked, you've settled in, did you ever look around and say, how did I end up here?
Absolutely. I was a young man at the time, very young. So that made it a little bit easier, perhaps. I was 22 years old, first time outside of the house, except outside of my parents' house, except for going to college. So I was ready for this, brand new adventure. I was at a point in my life where I was ready for something, but still, certainly there would be times. And I remember being at the orphanage in India, and where we lose electricity all the time. It was so remote. How Coca-Cola, they say anywhere in the world you go, you can get Coke. You couldn't get Coke where we were. We were beyond Coke. So that's how we're far away. And certainly there were times, even standing out the way that I'm a rather tall guy. I'm 6'3" and pale skin. So when you're in India and you're 6'3",
you're like Shaq.
Exactly. So, every time I would go out of our compound, just the stairs. And so definitely there were times that it was a surreal experience. Like what has God led me to? And
Yeah.
what exactly am I doing here?
Those moments where you're ministering to kids in an orphanage, I would have to think stay with you forever. I can't imagine,
Mm.
even when you leave there, those memories won't leave you. What do you remember most about what the definition of poverty looked like and what the definition of need looked like with those kids?
Yeah, yeah. The poverty, as you mentioned, it's overwhelming in much of the country, especially 20 years ago.
It's a
India
different
has.
definition, by the way, than what we define poverty as in America.
Oh, certainly. You would walk on the streets and you would see people literally starving, and not one or two, but just the streets lined with people at times, especially when I was in the bigger cities like Calcutta. You would see the streets absolutely lined with people, and the the level of poverty is overwhelming. The level of need is overwhelming. And I remember with the kids specifically that we would minister to who lived in our house, they were considered very blessed and fortunate compared to all the other kids that they went to school with, because our kids got a meat once a week and they got an egg once a week. And other than that, of course, our kids, they didn't go hungry. They ate rice all the time and vegetables. But just the fact that they got chicken once a week and an egg once a week, their friends were all really jealous of them. And even those friends in the school came from a higher economic level than, the kids in the street. And it's tragic. The kids on the street don't get to go to school at all. But, so these kids were just getting that made you really, really envious. It made the other kids envious of you getting that. So like you said, it gives you a whole different perspective of what poverty is and what we really need to survive.
Yeah, and I would think it also softens your heart considerably just about children in general. I have to think that Cam probably has this love of kids in his life that he never knew you were going to have it to that degree.
Definitely. I would enjoy the days so much. So our daily routine, the boys in the orphanage, they'd go to school and then they'd come back and I would be sort of their tutor. So I would spend a couple hours with them working on English, working on math. And then it was time for sports. So we would go outside and we either play football, which is soccer, they call it football. We would play basketball, and I introduced them to horse when I was there. So I would come up with all these trick shots, and these athletic little guys, 12, 13 years old, soon they were doing all of my athletic shots. So it was really, really fun spending that time investing in them. And then we'd have chapel every night where we would pray with them. We would teach them the scriptures. So an unforgettable time in my life for sure.
Are your language skills still up to snuff?
Well, see, that's the thing. When I said I'm American and I never thought I'd go overseas, I believe in specializing in one language and becoming really good at it. So I actually never learned the foreign languages. It wasn't a strength of mine. And in all of these places I went to, people really want to speak English to you. And English is spoken in India, in the Philippines, in Singapore. It's almost a first language of the streets. So unfortunately, to answer your question, all I know is English.
Well, it's the same with me. So I don't feel that bad. Now I don't feel like I'm that far behind. So when you feel that time of ministry coming to an end and it's time to come back home, you probably had a few choices to make. One is I could stay in ministry related activities, or I could venture out into the non-church world and try to live out my witness in a secular setting.
Yeah.
How did you end up pastoring Cornerstone in Mount Clemens?
Well, yeah. So we were part of Cornerstone Community Church in Singapore. It's quite a large church. So I was the missions pastor there, and my job was to oversee our churches all over the world. Singapore is not like some of the other countries I was in. Singapore is a very developed, first world, wealthy country where Delia and I were for several years, where she's from, and they had church plants all over the world. And really, when I felt that it was time to move to Michigan, it was explicitly to plant one of those churches. So I went to the senior pastor of our church, or the sort of overall leader of the movement, of the ministry, and told him that I'd like to plant a church in Michigan. And when we received his blessing, we started the transition process. We had to turn over my job overseeing all of the overseas churches. So we did come here explicitly with that plan. And again, I would say it was a drawing. It was a calling that I just felt I have to plant something. I have to, some of your listeners who might be entrepreneurs may have experienced this, even if it wasn't faith-based, but just this idea. I've been working for a company for some time. I need to branch out. I need to launch out. And that really was always the plan for me when we moved here was we needed to launch our own church, under God's direction. It was just that sense that it was time to launch out.
Okay, so at that time of transition back to America, what's the family look like? Who all's in the fold here for the Walcotts?
Right. So I have my wife. I call her the lovely and talented Delia.
Good idea. Good idea.
Very lovely, very talented, and she's a teacher. So she was a teacher in Singapore. She quickly plugged into a school here and became a high school teacher. And then we had our 3 kids. So at the time we moved here, Caleb was almost 10. He was 9, almost 10. Evan was 7, and Anna, our little girl, 2 years old.
So kids with passports that have lots of stamps in them and have been used to seeing all parts of the world.
Exactly. And they each had 2 passports. They're Singaporean and American. So very busy on the passport front.
Well, I'm going to kind of set up the next part of our conversation by saying this, Cam, because I've talked with a number of people over the years who are tangentially aware of the concept of being a missionary. Perhaps their church supports missionaries. Perhaps they've read some books. At least maybe they know Jim and Elizabeth Elliot's story. I mean, just tangentially connected. And the overarching belief is that if you go and serve in a remote part of the world, you ought to have some sort of an exemption card that says, hey, everything else after this is going to be smooth sailing, right? You almost like to think that that's some sort of the bargain that you made back when you said, I'll go wherever you send me, Lord.
Yeah.
That's not the reality. That's not the case, but that's kind of the perception, perhaps, because we as a culture generally find the commitment to be a missionary so overwhelmingly impressive that we'd like to think that entitles you to stress-free living moving forward. I'm sure you've heard that before.
Yeah.
Which leads us to October 5th of 2020. And I'm going to let you take it from here. Why is that date one that will live in infamy in your world? Yeah,
well, October 5th, I will actually talk about for a moment. My family had now been in the States for about 4 years. Caleb was 13 years old, 8th grader, but he was practicing with the varsity football team. So, really athletic kid, a basketball star, baseball star, as well as a 4.0 student. He wrote 5 books that actually are on Amazon. So author of 5 teenage, they're like a youth superhero stories, but very well developed. He wrote them when he was 11, 12. So brilliant kid, loved God, helped us in the church. And that was October 5th. And my wife, October 5th was a typical busy day for us. I rushed the boys to 2 different football practices. Delia stayed with Anna at home after going to school. We somehow found time for dinner in between and all of that. But then that evening we went to sleep like any other normal night. On October 6th, when I went to wake up the kids, as I always did, I woke up the 2 younger ones. They sleep upstairs, Evan and Anna, carried Anna down the stairs. And then I saw that Caleb wasn't sitting on the couch like he always was when I carried Anna down. Every morning he would wake up, when our alarm went off, he would read his Bible, actually. He would spend 5 minutes reading the Bible before he got breakfast and everything else. And he wasn't there. So, as a parent, alarm bells start going off in my mind. But also as a parent, how many times, if you've had kids, you worry, oh no, is something wrong with my child? And then of course, everything's fine. 100 times you worry and everything's fine. So I tell myself, everything's going to be fine. I go to his room and the light's not on. So I knocked on the door and Caleb didn't answer. At this point, of course, I'm really getting panicky, but still telling myself things will be okay. But when I turned on the light and tried to wake him up, Caleb did not wake up. And, I tapped him. He didn't wake up, called my wife down, and we realized something was terribly wrong. And, cut the long story short, I don't want to go into too many details, but of course the police came. They were so helpful. Everyone came so quickly. But what happened was during the night, Caleb had passed away due to a heart condition that we had no idea he had. So he had never shown any signs of a heart condition. Like I said, he was an 8th grader practicing football with 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, keeping up with them. So he had shown no signs that he had this condition, but subsequently we found out he did. And basically during the night, his heart had just gone haywire, and he had already passed several hours before we found him at around 7 a.m. So.
What? Okay. I knew that was coming, and I'm still not really sure what to say next, except,
Right.
wow. And what did you do next?
I mean, that's the question. Like, what do you do? What do you do in such a moment? That day, I'd like to say is the spiritual answer. And of course, my book, I know not all of your listeners are from the same background, but coming from a Christian background, being someone who has a relationship with Jesus, the right answer for me to say would be, oh, I felt God's presence and God's comfort, and
Right.
everything was fine. But that wasn't the reality in that first day. In that first day, I felt nothing but shock and unimaginable pain. The second day, the third day, it was all the same. We had so many people come and come around us, come to help us, and so grateful for that. But if I'm being honest, even for me, people would ask, "Oh, do you want this? Do you want us to come?" And my only answer was, "I don't care." The only thing I want, and I didn't say this to them because I also want to be polite, but this is going on in my mind. The only thing I want is Caleb to be back. And you can offer me anything. I don't care who comes. I don't care who goes. I don't care what we do. I only want Caleb to be back. And that was our initial reaction. But also at the same time, I can say I didn't feel God's presence, but yet I'm grateful for the background I'd had in the scriptures. I'm grateful for the background I'd had in faith, because even though I wasn't feeling anything, my wife and I did have this assurance that God is in control, and that of course Caleb was now in a better place because of his faith and his walk with Jesus. So the feelings were terrible, but there was some bedrock assurance that God was with us.
We are told in scripture that God can hear our groanings. If we can't get any words out, he can hear us just moaning, and is one with such compassion that words aren't necessarily needed in moments like that. Cam, I can't imagine, but I have to think that was kind of where you and your wife and your whole family were for a while.
Absolutely. I think having the 2 younger children, in a way, it probably helped us, because we realized we couldn't just be introspectively focused on our own grief, but we had to, Evan and Anna still needed to eat. Evan and Anna still needed to have dinner. They needed people around them. And of course, a lot of friends helped, but still at the end of the day, we needed to show them that life doesn't end for you, and life goes on. So I remember the first day taking Evan out. He was 11 at the time. He's 13 now. Taking Evan out for a walk, and just talking to him about what had happened. And so that was an important thing. Another interesting part of the story, we actually had planned the launch of our church for October 11th. So 5 days later, we were relaunching our church here in Mount Clemens. And of course, that presented a question. Now, what do we do? We've been preparing for this for weeks and weeks. What do we do? And I actually had prepared a message on the subject of hope several weeks before. If you're a pastor and you're having a big service, you normally like to plan ahead. So you plan your message ahead, you have everything ready. And my wife, Dilly, and I, we spoke, and what should we do about the church launch? And we both decided that we should go ahead and we should have the service. So that Sunday, I actually spoke that message on hope, the very message that that we had planned. I had planned several weeks before, and it was almost like God was speaking to me through the message that he had given me several weeks before. And
how did you make it through the message? My goodness.
Yeah, I remember towards the end, I made it through about 20 minutes. Okay. And then in the end, I turned it towards Caleb. And I remember saying the words that, I was talking about how God works all things together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose, Romans 8:28. But I remember saying in the message, but look, if God came to me right now and said, hey, Cameron, this is how I'm going to turn this for good. This is the reward you're going to get for this suffering. This is the reward Caleb already is getting for this suffering. I remember saying, I would just tell God, I don't want it. I don't want the reward.
Right. Give me my boy back.
Yeah. I just want Caleb. But yet I said this as well, that's my answer today. And that's my answer on this side of eternity. And even now, a year and a half later, I'd rather just have Caleb back than anything. But yet I know that if I could see how God sees, and if I could choose how God chooses, that wouldn't be my answer. Because in some mysterious way that I still don't understand here on earth, that I may never understand here on earth, when I see how God sees, when I'm in his presence, I'm going to realize that all things working together for good does mean all things, and that God is doing something great. And even from Caleb's perspective, if you had told Caleb the day before, this is about to happen to you, Caleb would have said, no way, no how. Again, he was an extremely joyful young guy. He was extremely talented. He had no desire to, if you had said, hey, you get to be in heaven, he would say, that's awesome, but give me another 70 years. Because there were a million things that Caleb was planning on doing. He was a musician. He was writing songs, writing books. Like I've already mentioned, all the sports. He could do anything he wanted, essentially. But yet again, from Caleb's perspective, once he went into the presence of Jesus, I think he would have said, okay, you guys, okay, God, you're right. This is better. These 70 years up here with you, it's better than the 70 years that I was expecting to have with my parents, that I was expecting to have with my friends.
Wait, what's the song? Better is one day in your courts than thousands elsewhere. And at the same time, Cam, we mentioned several minutes ago this belief or this perception that if somebody's going to commit themselves to be a missionary, that they should have a get out of misery free card.
Right.
Did you ever yell that back at the Lord? What are you doing? Look
Yeah.
what I did. Look what I did. Look what we committed to. Look what our family. Did you ever have those moments?
Yeah, I certainly had thoughts like that. Like I said, I guess I'd read the book of Job enough times to realize that arguing with God is futile. So to a certain extent, I can't say that I really ever shouted it out, but certainly I wondered, God, have I done something wrong? Or, is this some punishment? I knew that God is good. And honestly, in I guess just the way God made me, a thought I never had was, God is doing something evil. But a thought I had is, did I do something wrong? Or,
Wow.
is this, but basically that was more the thought, or God, do you not love me anymore? Something that was the most honest, deep thought, because again, I know God is good. He can't do evil. So, but did I do something to make him mad at me? Which of course is basically, it's a foolish thought once you.
Well, that's what Job's friends were telling him.
Exactly.
That's why Job's friends are lifted up as the example of how not to be a good friend in the time of trials.
And I was blessed not to have those types of friends, but I guess those were the internal thoughts that I struggled with more than the other. But of course, I was so blessed to have pastors alongside me who encouraged me, and that God is in control, but and we don't understand his ways, but his care and his love and his concern for me and my family was always the same.
Years ago, I saw a video as part of a conference I was attending. And the video showed a scene from nature. It was somebody shot it on a cell phone at like a safari out in the middle of nowhere. And it was the scene of a water buffalo, a baby water buffalo near a river.
Mm.
And the tourist was just taking a general shot of the scene. And as he panned across, he saw, oh, look at a cute little water buffalo. He continued to pan across, and he saw this, I guess it would be a den or a pack of lions slowly walking towards this baby. And now this guy, who knows who he is, the thing's been viewed 50 million times, but now he's narrating because he's safely away, and he's like, oh no, here's the baby, here's the pack, and he's going back and forth, and sure enough, they attack. And they are just savaging this poor little thing. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes the pack of adult water buffalo, and they
Right.
begin tossing the lions away. I mean, they are in full on attack mode because they know that one of their own is being harmed. I'm trying to give you the short version.
Right.
But as a viewer, you're like, hey man, it's too little, too late. It's just not gonna. I mean, poor thing's been turned into a roadkill by now. But
Yeah.
the dust settles. The whole thing the lions are running away, trying to save their own lives, and the baby actually kind of struggles up to its feet, and it's still alive. It's got some visible wounds, and it walks away surrounded by the adults.
Hmm. Right.
And our speaker, it was a group of men that he was addressing, got up and he came to the microphone, and all he said was, "Gentlemen, without the herd, your lunch."
Hmm.
And
Wow.
it is obviously it's still stuck with me all these years later, because the importance of having others come around you
Yep.
and help you at a time when you're feeling like the world's attacking and everything's caving in is so crucial. And it sounds like
Yep.
that's a blessing that you were able to experience, to have people of
Yep.
wisdom and faith come along and encourage you.
Absolutely. We were surrounded by people. My wife, her friends just flocked to her and held her up. The school that she teaches at, it's a private school, Christian school. And they gave her as much time off as she needed, and all of the teachers, principals, supported her so much, and myself as well. You mentioned that thing about missionaries, and how can anything bad happen to a missionary after you go through this? My aunt and uncle have been missionaries to Africa for about 35 years.
Man.
After this happened to Caleb, and they had 5 kids themselves. Their kids are all my age. Their kids are around 40. They're all 5 of the kids, and they encouraged us so much, as well as my mom and dad did when this happened. But interesting, or tragic, but also it's a lesson of God's faithfulness. This year, that uncle, he's my uncle Eldon, he actually passed away from COVID while in Africa, while
Wow.
ministering in Africa as a 72, 73. And that juxtaposition between what my uncle Eldon and Caleb, how my uncle Eldon had 70 good years of faithful service to God, how Caleb had 13 good years of faithful service to God, but how my uncle supported us and encouraged us in the time Caleb was taken, as well as my aunt Lois. And then, he encouraged me so much when that happened to Caleb. And the thing is, both of them, one had 73 years, one had 13 years, both have the same ending in God's presence. Both at the end, both of them are tragic, of course, but there's a difference between dying after a full life of 73 years and being taken away at 13. But yet both are in God's presence. And I learned that nobody's immune to the scars of life, whether you're a missionary, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a church member, whether you're an unbeliever. Nobody's immune from the scars of life. But the question is, how are we going to live until Jesus takes us? And the question is, when we do experience the scars, when it's something like my uncle being taken, or even my father just 3 months ago, he also was taken from COVID. He was best friends with my uncle. How are you going to respond? And I'm telling you, my wife and I have found such a reservoir of hope in Jesus, a reservoir of hope in our faith, that we still can't tell you the pain's taken away, but there's hope. And I've seen that in my aunt and in my mom, as their husbands were taken away in the last year, because of their faith, how they have this hope as well, this light that only comes from walking with Jesus.
And at some point, and by the way, folks, a reminder, all of this happened a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
Cam's not looking back on 20 years prior in a life filled with lessons. I would have to think that the pain is still very fresh and very real for your whole family, certainly for you and your wife. And to sit down and hammer out this very powerful book I'm holding called I Love You, Little Mister. And all you really have to do is look at the pictures on the front, and you realize that there was a special relationship between dad and his son. The subtitle is A Father's Struggle Towards Hope in the Ultimate Tragedy. And Cam, I don't know. I'm not asking you to rank them, but what would be one of the strongest struggles that you had and maybe are having? I don't want
Yeah.
to assume that you're past them all.
Yeah, I would say just missing Caleb. He was. I know everybody will say this after someone's taken away, and it can sound cliche. But Caleb was an absolutely remarkable young man and mature beyond his years. And as my firstborn, he started loving sports when he was 3 years old. The things that I love, faith and sports and family. Caleb was a carbon copy of me in those things,
Mm,
except that he also liked to cook. So that was the one skill he got that wasn't from me. But everything else, he was a carbon copy of me. And from the time he was 3, we would talk about whatever was happening in sports. And I would start teaching him. I remember Cleet Thomas hit a walk-off home run in 2010. For if there are any Tiger fans, that name may be familiar.
wow,
It was the
that's a
first
deep
time
dive.
3-year-old Caleb celebrated a sporting event with me, and he raised his hands and he jumped up and down our living room in Singapore. It was such a great memory. And, for 10 years, anything that happened, I would talk to Caleb about. And
Yeah.
then when we moved here, I became his coach in basketball and in flag football. And, we would discuss plays together constantly. And, of course, I was expecting this would continue the rest of my life. Of course, you're expecting that
Yeah.
one day I may pass away when I'm 70, 80, 90 years old, but Caleb's still going to be around. And then it was just taken. I think the biggest struggle is missing him and the abruptness of it. We had no warning. We had no chance to say goodbye. Like I mentioned briefly, my father was just taken away, and it also was quite quick, but we did have that couple of weeks of preparation.
Mm,
It's such a different
yeah.
experience when everything completely healthy and then gone. So yeah, I think the biggest struggle for me and my wife, I would say, is just the everyday he's not here. People talk about the holidays and birthdays, and for a lot of grieving people, those are especially tough dates. For me, it isn't even the holidays, and I think it's because we were so close to Caleb. It's the everyday just as much as it is Christmas or his
Mm,
birthday, and every single day missing him. Again, we're so blessed that we have Evan, now 13, and Anna, 8, and there's such lights in our life. But there's nothing like losing your firstborn in such an abrupt way that I would say that's the toughest part.
yeah. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, and I don't want to be in your shoes, but I so admire the wisdom that you share from pain.
Mm.
And we have my church in Saginaw, Michigan, has a grief share group that meets. I think it's every week, and it's a
Yeah.
pretty sizable group because, for whatever reasons, there are people hurting everywhere, and
Mm.
probably post pandemic, or as we get near to whatever that definition is, there's probably even more, whether it's the loss of someone or just kind of
Definitely.
the jarring of your personal system and rhythms, and wondering, maybe you lost your job, maybe you had all sorts of different things, but there's grief
Yeah.
everywhere. And as I think about the setting and the context for your book, I Love You, Little Mister, what is it that you hope a reader to the book or a listener of this conversation would take away when it comes to dealing with those moments when life just kicks you right in the teeth?
Right. Yeah. Really, the message of the book is that in any situation, there is hope through the gospel. There is hope through Jesus. And what I want people to experience, or what I want people to see through what we wrote and through the messages I preach, is that even on our darkest day, in our darkest moment, God is with us. And one of the things that God really made clear to me as I was writing the book, that just, as I looked into the scriptures, is that the amazing thing about Christianity is this: we don't just have a God who watches us from a distance. Even when it comes to our suffering, there are many faiths that will say, "Oh, suffering teaches you lessons," and that's true. Suffering does teach us lessons. Suffering makes us strong. Suffering can give us rewards. Christianity teaches that. Many other faiths teach that as well. But the unique thing about Christianity is that God doesn't only strengthen us and teach us through suffering, he also suffers with us. Jesus is beside the brokenhearted. The scripture says God is near to the brokenhearted. Hebrews tells us that Jesus suffered with us. He was tempted in all points like we are. He knows what it's like to be a human. And That's the amazing thing that I discovered. Like I said, the first 2 or 3 days, I didn't feel anything. So I can't be the hyper spiritual. Oh, I always felt God's presence right away. It wasn't the reality. But within a few days, my wife and I started sensing the presence of God. And we started sensing that in the middle of our worst time, He was actually with us and He was speaking to us and He was embracing us in His presence. And I would want people to know that number one, that there's hope. But then, sort of, the reason there's hope is that, yes, God is going to bring a reward through your suffering. But even more than that, He is with you, He is beside you. When you feel pain, in some mysterious way, Jesus feels pain. In some mysterious way, when you go through heartbreak, His heart is actually breaking. To me, I say it's mysterious because at the same time, I know that God is with Caleb right now.
Hmm.
Caleb is experiencing fullness of joy in God's presence. So God has joy, but also, his emotions are so multifaceted, more than we can imagine. His heart is broken with me. His heart's broken with Delia, with the rest of my family, with your family, those of you going through suffering, whether it's extraordinary tragedy, like the loss of a loved one, whether it's the everyday trials of life, like, different sicknesses and pains that we go through, or different struggles with your job, financial issues. God is with you. If you will turn to Him, you can experience hope and you can experience His presence either in the great ultimate tragedies or in the everyday pain, struggles that we all go through.
Amen, brother. That is the sermon.
Yeah.
That is the message. And I want to encourage everybody to pick up the book, I Love You, Little Mister by Cam Walcott. And maybe you pick it up only to pass it on to somebody else. You've listened to the conversation here and you might be thinking to yourself, well, I don't need the book. I just got the story from the guy who wrote it.
Right.
Fine. Get the book, give it to somebody else. Because as I said a moment ago, there are people hurting everywhere. And Cam, it is also not an easy thing to open yourself up, to share your grief, to bare your soul. So thank you for doing that. I mean, as I said at the outset, you and I know each other because we laugh through a sports podcast.
Right.
We talk about the toy box of life. And I know for you, so many of those moments of sports fandom are connected to the memory of your son.
Absolutely.
So it's one of those other, maybe one of those ways of keeping him fresh in your mind as you celebrate great sports moments. And thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah, thank you. And that is just what we want to do. We have a message, hope in your darkest day, that would be available. If anybody wants to hear the message, they can find me online and they can contact me. I would love to share with other people. So we're starting, you mentioned a grief group that meets in your church. So we've just gotten involved with the grief group here in Metro Detroit, and anybody that we can help, we'd like to speak to. So please reach out to us. You can go to Caleb's website, calebwalcott.com, and you can contact me that way for speaking, or even if you just need to talk, you can reach me and my wife that way. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, Lord's blessings on your entire family, Cam, and one of these days, let's go to a Tiger game.
That sounds great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be on the show. I love what you do. I've listened to your various podcasts, and God bless you. It's a great privilege to be here.